Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this event as part of the ESRC Festival of Social Science. My name's Ben Zaranko, and I'm delighted to be chairing this event today on a really important and increasingly topical issue of our public services and how they are faring in the current high inflation environment, what recent announcements on pay mean for those services, and what it means for the new Prime Minister and the new government. In his first speech, today's Prime Minister Rishi Sunak reiterated his commitment to the government's manifesto commitments back in 2019 on investing in our health service, our police, our armed forces, our schools, a commitment to levelling up. But he also reiterated the commitment to getting a grip on government debt. And I think squaring that circle and trying to balance those competing priorities will be one of the central economic challenges he faces. And that's why today's set of presentations will be so timely and hopefully really important background information for those interested in those issues. So today we're going to have three presentations. First from my colleague B. Boylo on the public spending outlook and how that is changing in light of recent pay awards. My colleague Lawrence O'Brien will then turn to how pay in the public sector compares to the private sector, how that's been changing over time, and what happens if we take into account public sector pensions. And then Luke Subieta will zoom in on schools in particular and use that as almost like a case study, which is like a microcosm of the broader issues which we're discussing here. Schools, of course, not only a big chunk of spending, but potentially central to any government seeking to boost the growth and potential of the UK economy. Now, if you'd like to ask questions, you can find a link to Slido. If you ask questions there and vote up any questions which you like the look of and would like to see answered, we'll hopefully have plenty of time at the end. And with that, I will hand over to B, and we'll see you for the Q&A shortly.
Thank you, Ben. So I'll start by talking about decisions that the new Chancellor faces on the level of public sector pay and the situation in terms of spending. So first, the current situation in terms of public sector pay. In last October's spending review, departmental budgets were fixed in cash terms over the next 3 years. This was a period in which inflation was expected to average 2.7% per year, and so budgets assumed that pay awards for public sector workers would be in the region of 3%. The double-digit inflation experienced this financial year was unpredicted and so unbudgeted for. This July, the government recognised that 3% would be insufficient in this inflationary environment, and so awarded public sector employees a pay rise of 5% on average. We estimate that these extra 2 percentage points on pay compared to the 3% pay awards budgeted for will increase staffing costs by around £5 billion this year alone. We can break down this cost to get a sense of which sectors will face the majority of these costs. And we do this based on the fraction of general government employment accounted for by each sector. And as this table shows, the overall additional cost, as I've said, is almost £5 billion, but the NHS and education sectors will face more than half of the costs of the awards. And that's as a result of the fact that they account for so much of general government employment. So far, departments have not been compensated for these additional costs, and it's going to be especially difficult for departments to meet them, given the general inflationary environment manifesting in things like rising energy prices. In separate IFS work, we estimate that the real terms generosity of departmental spending plans, as compared to when they were laid out in October last year, is down 5 billion this year, 14 billion in the next year, and 23 billion in the final year covered by the spending review. And even these higher than budgeted for awards may be insufficient, either to prevent concerns about recruitment and retention in the public sector, or to prevent widespread industrial action. Even 5% pay awards represent a real terms cut to public sector pay of around 5%, given that inflation is around 10%. And they're also expected to run slightly below private sector settlements this year. This all means that the Chancellor faces a range of trade-offs over pay, employment, and spending cuts, both this year and over the whole periods covered by the spending review. And I'm going to start by showing you one of those trade-offs this financial year. So here I'm going to assume for simplicity that departments keep their staffing budgets fixed, so additional pay awards are met entirely through changes to public sector employment. This is obviously a simplification, and it's true that departments might be able to find savings elsewhere in their budgets. But as I've said, given the inflationary environment, it's likely that such headroom, if it exists, will be shrinking. And so we think this is broadly accurate. On the x-axis here, I've got the average pay awards offered to public sector workers. And on the y-axis, I've got the necessary change to public sector employment that would be necessary to afford various different levels of pay awards. And I'm going to start off by showing you the trade-off under the assumption set out in last October's spending review, so assuming that the government offers no top-ups. And you can see first that offering a pay award of 3% on average is affordable without any changes to public sector employment. This is what was budgeted for, as I said, last October. Offering 5% pay awards on average, as was awarded this July, though, requires cuts to public sector employment of more than 100,000 workers without top-ups from the government. And offering inflation matching pay awards rather than 5% of around 10.5% would require cuts to public sector employment of almost 400,000 workers this year without additional money from the government. Now looking at the situation if pay bills are topped up by 4.8 billion. As you can see here, a pay award of 5% is now affordable with no change to public sector employment. But looking to the right, you can see that awarding a pay award of 10.5% still requires heavy cuts to public sector employment. Indeed, that's only with, as this blue line shows, top-ups of £17.9 billion this year that inflation matching top-ups would be affordable with no changes to employment. And these trade-offs aren't a problem for this year alone. Last October's spending review set spending allocations for the next 3 years. And so there'll be similar kinds of trade-offs in the final year covered by the spending review. And here I'm going to show you one of those trade-offs. This graph is slightly different. So on the x-axis here, you've got the top-ups offered by the government in 2024 to 2025, or the necessary change in spending. And on the y-axis, again, you've got the necessary change in public sector employment. And I'm going to illustrate the situation under two illustrative paths for public sector pay. First, I'm going to show you the situation if the 5% pay award this year is held to, and then public sector pay is kept constant in real terms, so increased with inflation in 2023 to 2024 and 2024 to 2025. And this is what this blue line shows. As you can see, to follow this path of pay awards and avoid any headcount cuts in the final year, £10.6 billion would be required in the final year in order to avoid this. If no top-up is offered and this pay award path is followed, there would need to be a 220,000 cut to public sector employment with no top-up. If instead, as unions have called for, inflation matching pay awards are instead offered in this financial year, and then the next two pay awards are also inflation matching, £25 billion would be required in the final year to avoid headcount cuts. Alternatively, there would need to be a 500,000 cut to public sector headcount without topping up departmental funding. And this all implies that the Chancellor faces a hard choice between funding additional pay awards or accepting a sharp deterioration in the quality of public services. And this deterioration could either come through increasing difficulties with recruitment and retention in the public sector if pay awards are just not offered, or it could come through sharp cuts to employment, as I've illustrated, if the pay awards are offered but departments not offered any more money in topping up. And delivering previous public service objectives, such as clearing the NHS backlog or levelling up primary education, already looked challenging last autumn when spending reviews were set out, and it now looks virtually impossible. It's even possible that some departmental budgets will be reduced rather than increased this autumn. And this points towards one of the longer-term policy issues that we discussed in our Green Budget chapter, and that has to do with reforming the spending framework. As I've discussed, public sector pay is set on an annual basis, while departmental budgets are set on a multi-year basis. The multi-year plans help departments plan over the slightly longer term, but they also make plans less responsive when conditions rapidly change, as we saw happen this financial year, with inflation going much higher than was predicted or budgeted for. Moving public sector pay to a longer term horizon to account for this would increase problems with public sector pay and flexibility and make it less competitive in comparison to the private sector. And if spending was fixed over just a single year to prevent this lack of responsiveness to changing conditions, it might stop departments from being able to plan into the future. A possible solution that we set out in our chapter is to continue the current planning timelines, but to create a framework where we automatically reassess and reopen settlements in exceptional circumstances, such as when pay is set above pre-specified limits. So I've shown that public sector pay awards need to be higher than was assumed last October when departmental funding was set, and shown that this can't be accommodated within those spending plans without cuts to public sector headcounts. Either spending plans must be topped up by the new Chancellor, or it must be accepted that the quality of public services will deteriorate. The 5% awards announced so far this year will run below inflation and will likely run below private sector pay settlements. I'll now pass on to my colleague Lawrence, who will talk in more detail about how the private sector compares to the public sector.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bea. So as Bea just said, the recruitment and retention of public sector workers is going to be a key issue for the government in the short and medium term. One thing that's going to be crucial for deciding, in determining this, is how much public sector workers are paid, and in particular, how this compares to pay in the private sector. So that's what I'm going to be looking at in this presentation. Now, of course, just one caveat to keep in mind is that pay isn't the only thing that matters when deciding where to work. Things such as how stressful the job is, to whether you get a company car, to many other things can also have an impact, but pay is obviously going to be a key determinant. So to start with, in this graph, I'm showing you the public pay differential all the way back to 1993-94. And just to define what this is, as I'm going to be talking about the public pay differential a lot throughout this presentation, this is the percentage difference in pay in the public sector relative to the private sector. So a positive public pay differential means that public sector workers are getting paid more than private sector workers, and a negative one means that public sector workers are getting paid less. In 2021-22, we estimate a public pay differential of about 7%, and this means that average hourly pay in the public sector is 7% higher than average hourly pay in the private sector. And although this is a positive number, we can see that overall we find a decreasing trend, especially since 2011-2012, and that the public pay differential is at its lowest point in 2021-2022 since at least the early 1990s. Now, this is what happens when we can compare average pay in the two sectors. This might not give a good indication of the relative generosity or the relative pay in the two sectors for similar workers. And that's because the two sectors differ in composition. In particular, the workforce in the public sector tends on average to be more highly educated, tends to be older, and they tend to have more experience. And all of these factors would lead these public sector workers to expect to be paid more, whether they work in the public or the private sector. And therefore, the direct comparison between average pay that I did on the previous slide might not give a good idea of how much similar workers would expect to get paid in the two different sectors. So what we're going to do is control for these differences between the two workforces using labour force survey data and regression analysis. And this will allow us to look at the public pay differential for otherwise similar workers and give a better idea of the outside option that workers actually face. So that's what I'm going to do now in this yellow line. What we can see is that we find a lower public pay differential after controlling for things such as sex, age, education, etc. And this is because public sector workers tend to be older and tend to be more highly educated, as I mentioned before. Nevertheless, the trend over time is similar to the unconditional difference. We see a decrease in the public pay differential in the last decade or so, reaching about zero for 2021-22. And this means that on average, similar workers in the public and private sector earn similar hourly pay. So this is the average public pay differential. But how does this differ for different groups? So to start with, let's look at the public pay differential across the wage distribution. I'm going to spare you all the gory details of the econometrics, but what we can see in this graph is that we estimate a positive public pay differential at the bottom of the wage distribution and a negative public pay differential at the top of the wage distribution. In other words, lower paid workers tend to do relatively better in the public sector than in the private sector, whilst higher paid workers tend to do relatively worse in the public sector compared to the private sector. Another way of thinking about this is that the wage distribution is more compressed in the public sector than in the private sector. So next, how does it differ for men and women? So that's what I'm showing in this graph, with women in purple and men in blue. While we can see a fairly similar trend over time for the two groups, we can see that in all years, we estimate a higher public pay differential for women than we do for men. We think there's two main reasons why we estimate this. The first is that women tend to be especially overrepresented in lower paid occupations in the public sector. And as I showed in the previous graph, these lower paid occupations tend to have a higher public pay differential. So an example of this is that although almost 3/4 of teachers in the public sector are women, when it comes to teaching assistants, which is relatively lower paid, almost 90% of these are women. The second reason why we estimate a higher public pay differential for women than for men could be that women are more likely to work part-time than men, and we know from other evidence that there's a lower part-time penalty, wage penalty in the public sector than in the private sector. Finally, let's look at differences in the public pay differential for different regions of the UK. So that's what we can see here for 2019 to 2021. And the first thing we can see is that there's quite a lot of variation in this public pay differential across the UK. We estimate a negative public pay differential in the southeast, London, and the east of England. So similar workers in the southeast of England working in the public sector, and about 8% less per hour than those working in the private sector. Whilst we estimate a positive public pay differential in the other regions of the UK. So all this up to now has been looking at the public pay differential in terms of pay. But as I said at the start, there are other things that matter when deciding where to work. Many of these things we're not going to be able to capture with our analysis. One thing we can look into is differences in pensions. And we think this is going to be important because public sector pension provision is much more generous on average than in the private sector. We can see that in this table here. We can see there's higher pension participation in the public sector than in the private sector. And more importantly, we can see that there's much higher pension participation in defined benefit schemes, which tend to be more generous. And we can see an illustration of this at the bottom here. Almost half of public sector workers receive an employer pension contribution worth over 20% of pay, compared to just 2% of private sector employees. And this is obviously a part of remuneration, but it's not going to be taken into account in the pay figures we showed so far. So we think it's important to add on this employer pension contribution into remuneration. To do this, we're going to have to use a different data set to what we did for our previous analysis. And that's because the labour force survey doesn't contain any information on pensions. Instead, we're going to use the annual survey of hours and earnings. So to start with, let's replicate our previous analysis using this new data set. We find broadly similar results, and we find an average unconditional difference of about 8% in 2021. And then once we control for things, this becomes slightly negative. Now let's add on employer pension contributions. This leads to a much bigger public pay differential. The average unconditional difference becomes 20%. And even once we control for things, we still find a positive difference of about 6%. So this suggests that it really does matter taking into account these employer pension contributions. How has it changed over time? So to start with, repeating our previous analysis using the new data set, we find a broadly similar pattern with the public pay differential decreasing, especially since 2012-2013, and reaching its lowest point in 2021. Once we add in employer pension contributions in the purple line, we can see that this drastically increases the public pay differential in all years of the analysis. We find a similar trend, though, with it decreasing, especially since 2013, and reaching its lowest point in the most recent year. Overall, the fact that we find this purple line being so much higher suggests that the pay is basically more pensions heavy in the public sector. So we can look at this and quantify this in a bit more detail in this graph here. So what I'm showing you is the percentage of pay in each sector that comes, that is sort of take-home pay, so pay that you receive now, versus pay that goes into your pension, either employee or employer pension contributions. So looking at 2005, we can see that about 87% of total remuneration was take-home pay in the public sector, compared to 95% in the private sector. By 2012, the story was pretty similar for the private sector. We saw that take-home pay share reduced a bit in the public sector. By 2021, this had reduced even more. So by this point, over 20% of total remuneration in the public sector, on average, came in the form of deferred pay, that is, pensions. And this compares to just about 7 or 8% in the private sector. And this leads us on to one of the longer-term policy issues that we discussed in the report we released, especially around the structure of public sector remuneration. So as I just showed you, remuneration in the public sector is increasingly skewed towards deferred pay. However, especially today, during a cost of living crisis, take-home pay might be more important to employees. For example, you can't pay your energy bills using your employer pension contributions. Now, private sector workers often can do something about this. They tend to be more likely to be in defined contribution schemes, so they can reduce their employee pension contribution a bit, keep most of their employer pension contribution, and then they'll have more take-home pay, which they can use to spend today. For public sector workers with defined benefit pensions, they don't have such an easy option. Instead, they have a binary in-out decision. Either you're in your pension, making those employee pension contributions, but receiving that really generous employer pension contribution, or you opt out, you gain because you don't have to make those employee pension contributions and you get more pay today, but you lose a big chunk of your total remuneration, that employer pension contribution. And we're starting to see some sort of headlines talking about this. There are some, for example, this comes from Cambridge News. There's some people in Addenbrookes Hospital who've opted out of their NHS pension because of the cost of living crisis. So that leads us on to a potential sort of policy sort of option. So when thinking about what we could do with public sector pay, obviously many public sector employees would like the government to increase both their pay and the generosity of their pension. But as Bea said, there's a lot of spending pressures at the moment, and that might not be feasible. If we're taking the total level of remuneration as given, then we could think about reducing employee pension contributions in the public sector, reducing their pension value as well, but they could also have an increase in take-home pay. And this would leave total remuneration fixed, but it could prevent a rise in opt-outs. And if public sector workers do prefer take-home pay to deferred pay, this could lead to an increase in public sector workers' welfare, at least for many of them. So that's all from me. This has all been quite high level, looking at the public sector as a whole. I'm now going to hand over to Luke, who's going to zoom in to issues facing schools.
Can someone confirm they can see my screen, because it doesn't seem to be going on to presentation view at the moment.
Yeah, it's not on presentation view, but we can see it.
Okay, 1 second. Thank you. That's perfect now. So sorry for the slight hiccup there. So I'm going to talk about the specific pressures on the example of schools, both on public sector pay and public spending levels. So to give an overview of the key conclusions, I always like to give the game away straight away. So we know there have been large increases in teacher and in support staff pay for this year, average around 5% for teachers and maybe about 8 to 9% for support staff pay. But that's still going to be below expected levels of inflation for this year. Recently, we've seen a return to growth in school spending per pupil after about a decade of decline. But that still won't get spending per pupil back to 2010 levels, because costs are rising faster than was expected when these spending plans were set out. Looking to the future, there are a number of challenges facing schools, both in terms of total spending and in terms of getting the right teachers into the right places. From about this year onward, overall pupil numbers are falling, which could allow for the school's budget to fall in real terms and make some savings for the exchequer. But falling pupil numbers create their own resource problems. And finally, getting teachers into the right places remains a persistent problem. This is both in terms of getting the right teachers with subject expertise, but also encouraging teachers to apply to schools in more deprived areas. Starting with the spending and cost pressures. So this year there was an increase in the schools budget of around £4 billion, which included compensation for the then new health and social care levy, which has now been removed, and that compensation will be removed as well. Between 2022 and 2024, there was due to be a further rise of around £3 billion. And that was going to allow school spending pupil to return to 2010 levels by 2024. But there are now a range of cost pressures acting on schools' budgets, starting with energy. So we estimate that a 50% rise in energy costs over the past year would have increased schools' costs by around 400 million. And that's a really broad brush average. And there's going to be a huge amount of uncertainty around that, depending on when schools' contracts were up and also the age of school buildings and the extent to which they've received recent maintenance. The energy price caps is going to put a lid on those costs for the next 6 months, but there's obviously a large amount of uncertainty and nervousness about what happens after those 6 months are up. But some of the biggest cost rises will be in terms of staff costs, which take up around 80% of schools' budgets. So from September 2022, starting salaries of teachers went up by around 9%, whilst pay for more experienced teachers rose by around 5%. And that equates to an average rise across all teachers of around 5 to 6%, because most teachers are on the upper parts of the pay scale. But for most teachers, that's still going to equate to a real terms cut in salaries, and comes on the back of 10 years of cuts to real terms salary levels. And this is illustrated in this graph. So the green bar shows the expected real terms change in teacher salary levels this year. And the yellow bars show how that accumulates to real terms changes back to 2010. So this year, new teachers will see a small real terms increase in their salary of around 0.5 to 1%. But most teachers will see a real terms cut of 2 to 3%. And most teachers are on the upper parts of the pay scale, which is labelled U1 to U3 here. And that accounts for the majority of teachers. So most teachers will be seeing a 3% cut in real terms pay this year. And that comes on the back of 10 years of real terms cuts, which means that most more experienced teachers will be seeing real terms pay cuts of around 12% since 2010. New teachers' salaries will also be lower in real terms than they were in 2010 by around 4%. And cuts in the real terms value of teacher pay is one of the main ways in which cuts to school spending have been delivered over the previous decade. But the increases in teacher pay are actually smaller compared with the expected increase in support staff pay. So local government employers have proposed a nearly £2,000 pay rise for most pay grades covered by support staff in 2022. And that's likely to equate to a rise around 8 to 9%, given the sorts of staff that work in schools. Partly that's driven by desire to meet cost of living increases, but it also reflects the fact that the national living wage is increasing by 7% this year, and the national living wage has been gradually catching up with pay scales for local government employers. So that's naturally going to add a large amount of costs to schools this year, and was certainly more than was expected. However, it's also going to create a source of problems and uncertainty, partly because it's not actually confirmed yet, so it's not being paid, even though this applies from April 2022. So a large amount will have to be paid as back pay to support staff, and that isn't great. It isn't a great way of delivering pay levels. But also in the case of academies, we have to deliver it in back pay after their financial year has ended. So academies' financial years go from September to August each year, and they thought they probably have tied up their budgets for the year, but they will now have to pay back pay for around 3 or 4 months of a financial year that's already ended. So going on to how this affects, how these cost pressures affect expected trends in spending per pupil. This graph shows the level of school spending per pupil relative to its level in 2010. And as you can see, during the mid-2000s, there was growth in school spending per pupil, and it reached a high point around 2010. After that, there was about a 9% fall in school spending per pupil between 2010 and 2019. After this point, the government has announced a range of increases in school funding, which has led to a return to growth. And based on the OBR's forecast for inflation back in March this year, we expected school spending per pupil to return to 2010 levels by 2024. But once we account for all the additional costs that schools are now likely to face, both in terms of teacher pay, support staff pay, energy, and as well as food prices going up, we now expect that school spending per pupil will be around 3% lower in 2024 as compared with the 2010 level. So this is another good example of how spending plans aren't delivering as much as expected when they were set out. Looking to the future, we're expected to see a reversal of a trend that began during the last 10-15 years. So the last 10-15 years, it's been a feature of school funding that pupil numbers have been going up year on year as part of a population boom. Pupil numbers are now expected to peak around 2024 and have already been falling in primary schools. And we now expect there to be a 5% fall in the number of pupils between 2025 and 2028. So on some level, that could allow the government to cut the overall schools budget and potentially deliver a savings exchequer, but protect school spending per pupil in real terms. So, for example, the government could commit to a real terms freeze in school spending per pupil between 2024 and 2027, and at the same time deliver a 5% fall in total spending, which could help in the medium-term fiscal forecast. However, falling pupil numbers bring their own source of challenge. So one would naturally expect total budgets to be falling in line with pupil numbers, but the key question is, will schools' costs fall in proportion to falling pupil numbers? And that's going to be a challenge in some individual schools. So, for example, school classes might fall from, say, something like 30 or 25, but that doesn't change the cost of having a teacher in front of that class of 25. The school's budget will only be able to really be able to deliver savings if staff numbers also fall in line with pupil numbers, and potentially also the number of schools. So it creates a whole different set of challenges in terms of delivering those savings. And finally, there is a persistent problem that has been true for the last 10, maybe 20, maybe 30, maybe even a lot longer, is getting the right teachers to the right places. So the government has been missing recruitment targets in many science, technology and language subjects for at least the last 10 years. But that's been getting worse over the last year or two. So there was a brief recovery during the pandemic, but we're now seeing government missing recruitment targets for teacher training places in physics, technology, computing, languages, which is going to make it hard for schools to fill vacancies in those subjects. And there's also been a persistent problem about getting recruiting teachers, particularly in maths and science teachers, to the most deprived schools outside of London. So as a good example of that, if we look at physics and the most deprived set of schools outside London, only 50% of physics teachers in those schools have a physics degree. Getting teachers with the right level of qualifications in more deprived areas outside London is extremely challenging in the current situation. So to conclude, school budgets have been are currently under a significant amount of pressure due to rising costs, and that's come from energy and food prices, but also more importantly from unexpectedly high increases in teacher pay and support staff pay. There's going to be further financial challenges from declining pupil numbers, and that's going to create challenges overall, but there's also going to be differences across region, with bigger falls in pupil numbers expected in London and the South East, as well as in the North East. And getting the right teachers to the right places has been a persistent problem of at least the last 10, 20 years. That's both in terms of getting good qualified math, science and languages teachers, but also trying to get high quality teachers to apply to more deprived schools outside of London. So that's where I'll stop and hand back to Ben. I'm very happy to take questions and thoughts.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Bea, Lawrence and Luke. We've got some questions coming in on Slido. Would encourage you to add as many questions as you like. We'll get through as many as we can and to upvote those which you like the look of. Perhaps I'll start with the most popular question on Slido, which is why should public sector workers get inflation matching pay rises if private sector workers do not? So perhaps Bea or Lawrence, one of you might talk about why that comparison with the private sector is important and whether, in fact, we should be offering full inflation pay awards this year and next. Maybe Bea to start.
Sure. So it's true that private sector settlements aren't going to be inflation matching either, although we do expect them to run higher than was awarded in the public sector this year. The private sector is also more likely to pay bonuses, which further increases the offering in the private sector. And as Lawrence discussed, public pay settlements have increasingly shrunk over the last decades compared to the private sector. So it's worth thinking about what might keep pay constant in real terms. We also think it's worth looking at inflation matching costs as one of the benchmarks that we consider, since this is what unions have been consistently demanding. So worth looking at that. A competitive pay offer is especially important given the tightness of the labour market right now as well. Do you want to add anything, Lawrence? Or
not a lot. I think it's just we have seen the sort of difference in pay between the public and private sector has, the public sector is looking increasingly less generous over the past 10 years. And I think, for example, Luke highlighted there are definitely some problems to do with recruitment and retention of public sector workers or teachers in some areas at least. So, a good pay settlement, maybe it's not quite inflation matching, could be, something that helps with this.
And I think there's something worth bearing in mind, which is sort of what the purpose of public sector pay awards ought to be. And I think that the focus really should be on trying to make sure that the government has the right number of workers with the right skills and the right places to deliver on public service objectives, whether it be levelling up, clearing the backlog, whatever it happens to be. And therefore, the private sector benchmark is probably the most important one and should be the starting point for any analysis. But of course, when you're threatened with widespread strike action with unions demanding much more than that, it's also useful to consider a broader range of benchmarks. But the question is a good one. So there's a couple of questions here around sort of where, if the government were to increase the generosity of its pay awards, and even if it doesn't, where some of these cuts and these savings might come from. I think there's an issue of the fact that higher inflation or higher energy bills, etc., means that government departments are already being asked to make savings in order to meet the costs of those. And there's a question here which explicitly says, if we're cutting hundreds of thousands of public sector workers, is that possible? Could departments function? So maybe Luke, if schools were to take their share of that, and if they were to be cutting back their staff and their headcount, how feasible is that? What sort of impact might it have?
So I think that's an excellent question, and I'd be certain that the Department for Education is currently putting in a submission to the Treasury talking about how disastrous that would be. But it does come to the point of school budgets over the last 10-15 years, whereby in order to make savings, they have to make cuts in staff levels, because 80% of schools, 80 to 85% of schools' budgets are on staffing levels. And many of those staffing levels are now effectively statutory. So it would be very, very difficult to cut teacher levels. And it's also very hard to cut support staff levels as well, because a lot of those are a product of statutory entitlement for pupils with high needs, or because schools are now having to take on the roles that are previously taken on by local authorities. So I think the only real way to cut staffing levels in schools would be to try and reduce the level of things that schools are doing, and kind of reduce what they do. But that brings with it its own problems and its own controversies.
Yeah, and I think if we take another big chunk of the public sector, the health service, we know the NHS is already struggling to get its levels of activity back to where they were pre-pandemic, and accordingly it's struggling to make headway on the backlog of elective care that's built up. And so it's hard to see how cutting the number of NHS staff is going to make doing things like that any easier. I know one thing that's been talked about is cutting civil service numbers. This 90,000 number floats around a lot, which is the increase in the civil service more or less since Brexit. Now, there may well be savings that could be made in reducing civil service headcount, but you've got to remember that Brexit has also come with new things that the civil service is responsible for. So a new agricultural subsidy regime in DEFRA that requires people to do it. They're being asked to do more. Maybe they need more headcount. So I think that Luke's right that the main way we'd see big reductions in headcount is if there's commensurate reductions in what the government is actually doing. So Lawrence, there's a question here about the sort of, I guess, the short term versus the long term when it comes to wanting to increase people's pay in the short term in the light of higher cost of living and recruitment difficulties and so on, versus sort of the longer term question of trying to ensure people have adequate savings in retirement, and whether there might be pressure for DB schemes in the public sector to be more, to shift towards defined contribution. And there's also a separate question which I've lost, but I think was about the adequacy of pension saving in the two sectors. Whether maybe, is there any argument that public sector workers, some of them might be over saving, some of them might be not saving enough for their retirement. I wonder if you've had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think, well, there's quite a lot there. Regarding your first point about whether it's, potentially sensible for some workers to reduce their pay now and how that trades off about, their retirement income in the future. I think it is a difficult, it's a difficult balance. I mean, we're living through, quite a tough time. We are, as an economy, getting poorer, and so we are going to have to make some of these difficult choices. And I think it really depends on, who we're looking at here. If we're looking at public sector workers, a lot of them do have, pretty generous pensions. So, if it was possible for these pensions to be slightly less generous and for them to get a bit more take-home pay today, I think some of them would think that that would be, an option they'd quite like. Whereas if we look at in the private sector, potentially they're not getting these so generous defined benefit pensions. Again, it's sort of more on a case by case basis. And yeah, I guess I can't give a one size fits all answer. I think it's unlikely that you mentioned about the public sector switching away from defined benefit pensions. I think that's, potentially quite unlikely. I mean, I think, the public sector pensions, a lot of them are sort of pay as you go pensions or unfunded pensions. So, the government's receiving tax money now to pay for pensions for people, public sector workers who are retired now. So, it's difficult to sort of see how they can change, that involve a drastic change to move away from that towards a defined contribution scheme. And, because of that, there is definitely going to be some pressures if we as an economy aren't going to be as big as we thought in the future on this pay-as-you-go scheme. But it's difficult to sort of see. I think that's potentially not something that's such a problem yet. Regarding the literature on sort of the adequacy of pension saving, there is definitely, that's quite an active research topic. And again, it really depends on who you're looking at. So there was some IFS work that came out almost probably a decade ago now, which was looking at people who were approaching retirement at that point. And actually it found that quite a lot of people were doing, looked like they had quite a decent retirement income ahead of them. Potentially a lot of them had, got a house that they owned. A lot of them maybe had quite generous defined benefit pensions, as these were more common as well in the private sector in the past. But I think the story potentially has changed, at least for the private sector to some extent. We've seen, for younger generations, they're struggling to get on the housing ladder, and defined contribution pensions have really become the norm in the private sector over the past sort of 20, 30 years. So, what level of defined contribution pension saving do you need to be doing is a very open question. There is some recent research suggesting that even after automatic enrollment into pensions, people aren't potentially saving as much as they should be. And, there's an open question about whether we should be trying to encourage people to save more. What I would say is that, maybe that is a potential good policy for the future, but it's, up for debate whether a cost of living crisis is the right time to implement such a policy.
Yeah, that's all. I agree with all of that. One thing I would add is that perhaps the key barrier to moving away from DB towards DC pensions in the public sector may well be the trade unions, and doing that at the same time as real terms cuts to take-home pay would be tricky to say the least.
Yeah.
Luke, I wonder if we might turn to schools funding in a bit more detail. So there's a few sort of quick fire questions here. One is about the symmetry of what you talked about. So if you're saying that when pupil numbers fall, school costs may not fall because you still need the same number of classrooms, even if there's fewer kids in them. Why does the opposite not apply? So when pupil numbers were rising, why do we talk about falling funding per pupil when the costs may have stayed constant, say?
Yeah, I think it's a really good and interesting question, and it kind of reveals some of the pressures on schools in the last few years and what's going to happen. So I think it's partly a kind of macro thing. So it's very easy to see within an individual school that if you had an extra 5 pupils, it doesn't increase your cost very much, because you could put an extra pupil in extra those 5 classes and you'll be fine. And that may work when you're thinking about an individual school with a few extra pupils. When you're talking about an entire system with 1 million extra pupils, it's not really feasible just to plug them into extra classes. It kind of requires extra schools, extra teachers. And one of the reasons, and that's a challenge from actually getting the money to pay for them, but it's not a controversial challenge in terms of providing this policy perspective. We want to recruit more teachers, we want to build more schools. Those are usually things that are uncontroversial with the public and uncontroversial with public sector workers. When you're in an era when you're going to get around 500,000 fewer pupils, you're going to need fewer schools overall and fewer teachers overall. And that's more a challenge in terms of ensuring you do actually reduce staff numbers and you do actually reduce the number of schools overall. So it's it's kind of an asymmetric debate issue. It's uncontroversial to be talking about increasing staff numbers. It's much more controversial and much more difficult to cut staff numbers and the number of schools.
Okay, so it's almost like there's the inbuilt asymmetry almost acts to sort of structurally push up spending on schools through demographic bulges and troughs, almost like it's much easier to increase it than it is to cut it again afterwards. Is that fair?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's one of the problems with the current situation is that we really did need those extra schools and extra teachers over the last 10 years, but we might not need them so for very long, which is a problem for a service that's used to long run plans. It's the basic problem there's been a large increase in pupil numbers over a very short period of time that won't last.
Sounds like a recipe for the temporary classrooms that I remember in my school days, which were not very warm. There's another question, Luke, on whether falling funding per pupil, whether there's any evidence that that's affected pupil attainment or performance. Is there any evidence on that?
It wouldn't really be possible to. So what you want to know is what happened to national pupil results if pupil spending hadn't fallen. But we never observed that counterfactual. And it's incredibly hard to discern it from descriptive statistics. What we know from most of the academic literature is that falling levels of spending per pupil does lead to reductions in pupil outcomes. And that's been tested across a range of settings and contexts. So one would expect it to reduce outcomes compared with a situation where pupil spending hadn't fallen. And we know that the pupils that benefit most from spending and receive the biggest shock when spending is reduced are people from deprived backgrounds because they benefit more from being in school.
Okay, one last one on schools funding, and we might zoom back out again. So this, I know you and I talked about this before, Luke, is this question of the compensation for the health and social care levy. So for anyone who's not, if you're fortunate enough not to be buried in the details of this stuff, when Rishi Sunak announced the health and social care levy, which is effectively an increase in national insurance, that also increases the costs for public sector employers like your schools, your hospitals, your prisons, because they have to pay higher national insurance for the staff that they employ. So the Treasury said, we're going to compensate you for that, so you won't be any worse off as a result of this tax rise. Now, that tax rise has since been cancelled or undone, and the Treasury haven't, I don't think, said this publicly, but they've confirmed privately that the compensation for those public sector employers will also be withdrawn. So the schools budget, the NHS budget, the prisons budget will be reduced so that those departments are no worse off because their staffing costs are lower, but their budget will be on paper lower. as well. Now, the question on Slido, Luke, is how that funding is actually going to be removed, because the mainstreaming of the supplementary grant has already been announced by DfE. So I don't know if you have any light to shed on that. I would just say that I don't know how it's going to be removed. My expectation would be that the spending plans and departmental settlements that were published alongside the spending review will have to be adjusted accordingly. We may well get that at the fiscal event next week if it goes ahead. But on the specifics of DfE, do you have any thoughts, Luke?
Yes. So this is one of the issues. I was pleased to see a question on this because it's an interesting issue. Sorry, I suddenly lost my train of thought and lost in the issue itself. So the issue is basically that the Department for Education was incredibly sensible at how it allocated the funding for this, and will kind of pay the price for being very, very sensible. So they put all this extra compensation funding into their main school funding system because they wanted to keep everything nice and simple. So it's basically just gone into the basic amount you get for a pupil aged 4 to 11 or a pupil aged 11 to 16. So they've mainstreamed it and made it very part of the normal standard school funding settlement in the removal of the health and sexual care levy, and the planned removal of that compensation means they kind of have to do that very sensible policy decision. So it will only be able to be delivered by cutting planned school funding rates for next year. And I suspect the Department for Education hasn't gone into that details of that funding announcement yet, because they're waiting to see what happens in the medium-term fiscal statement, which is a very sensible approach. But it's important to also state that this should be financially neutral for schools. They're not having to pay the health and social care levy anymore, and they're not receiving the compensation to pay for it. But DfE will have to go through various hoops to try and actually make it cost neutral for schools, because it gets complicated because they've been very, very sensible in the first place.
Yes, one of the many hidden costs of having such policy instability and so many U-turns. Although we may well, to simplify this, we may well find out next week that the health and social care levy will happen after all and will remain in place. So we'll have to wait and see. There's a question here from John, who I applaud as the only person brave enough to put their name down on Slido. He says, how can we reach a consensus that in order to have some good public services, we need to pay more in some collective way? Not taxation, then what? So it's a big question. I think it's ultimately a political question, John, about creating the sort of, if you want to create demand for more public services and you want to convince people that it's worth paying higher tax to do that, that's a task for a politician. I think that there's a few points to make. One is that we've seen in recent weeks some of the dangers of thinking that you can permanently detach our levels of tax and levels of spend. They can't, diverge forever. Eventually, plugging that gap with borrowing raises questions about sustainability of public finance. I think that the new Prime Minister, during his period as Chancellor, was willing to put up taxes in order to increase spending, and that might be an approach that we see carry on. But I think there's a bigger question about the challenges posed by ageing and the pressures that places on the NHS, on our state pension bill, on our social care bill. And so there are questions about how much funding should come from the state. So if the government was serious about trying to reduce government spending in order to reduce taxes, there are radical things they could do around, more role for charging in the NHS. We already charge for prescriptions. Could you apply that more widely? Could you think about means testing the state pension? Could you think about, maybe scaling back the generosity of the proposed social care funding reform? So there is a balance to be struck about the public versus private contribution to these things. But those are questions, first and foremost, for politicians, because they're distributional questions. If any of you have any comments on that, do jump in. Otherwise, I will plow on with a question. Sort of two questions I'm going to group together for you, B, which is about this sort of public versus private comparison and what's happening in the broader economy. So one is there a danger that if we're comparing public and private sector analysis, public and private sector wages, that we're sort of pitting workers against each other? You might have some thoughts on why we do that exercise. And then relatedly, I guess, is what the path is for the wages in the wider economy, And if high inflation, but also economic headwinds feeds through to that, how might that feed through into decisions about public sector pay?
Sure. So I guess one of the reasons we're consistently kind of providing this comparison between the public and private sector is rather than kind of pitting workers against each other, is more to kind of provide a picture of how much recruitment and retention might be affected in the public sector by more widespread changes. So we think that for public sector workers, a key issue is going to be how much they might expect to earn elsewhere if they leave their jobs and go and work in the private sector, or for workers making a choice over which sector to join, the relative pay offerings and pension offerings, among other things, in the two sectors is going to be really key in affecting their decision. So it's just to kind of help make our analysis of public sector pay trends richer and enable us to look at kind of whether recruitment and retention might be expected to be affected more for various workers. So the kind of breakdowns that Lawrence provided of more highly paid workers, or for women versus men, or factors like that, I think. Sorry, do you mind just repeating what the second part of that question was?
Sure. So it's just about the sort of broader economic outlook and how, given what you've said about the importance of thinking about the private sector benchmark, but if we're seeing in the wider economy higher nominal pay growth, so cash pay growth, than we might otherwise have expected, but perhaps below inflation, what pressures will that put on the public sector, and how might public sector workers feel about the sort of deal they're getting?
Yeah, so we might expect that to really kind of worsen these recruitment and retention challenges for public sector workers if they're not seeing the same kind of pay growth. And indeed, if the government doesn't make any changes to the 5% pay awards offered this year, that might then be really challenging for public sector workers, and we might see kind of increased numbers of public sector workers perhaps deciding to move to the private sector if wages are growing significantly faster there.
There's a question here about this, what you were talking about, Lawrence, this sort of, might workers be willing to trade higher pension tomorrow, trade some of that away for higher pay today? And I think I agree with you that lots of workers might quite like that deal, particularly at the present moment in time, and given the inflexibility of their pension arrangements. I guess there's a question which raised here, is that might that push up borrowing in the near term if effectively the government's paying more out in pay today and less out in pensions, say 20 years down the line? Well, it's possible that's true. I think that in general, we would say that policy decisions shouldn't be based on the accounting treatment and their sort of short versus long-term public finance impact. If that's a better policy mix and a better way to structure remuneration, and that would lead to a better deal for public services, I think that would be the argument for doing it, not because it might push up borrowing in the near term. I guess also if the government's framing all of its fiscal targets and through the lens of is debt falling in a particular year, providing it pushes borrowing and debt up in every year sort of roughly equally, that wouldn't make it any more difficult to achieve, I don't think. But I think that it shouldn't be the primary lens through which we view such policy debates. Luke, very quickly on how pupil funding varies across disadvantaged and more disadvantaged schools, and maybe how that's changed over time. And I think we're going to have to wrap up after that. Sure.
So currently, schools in more deprived areas or in more deprived intakes receive higher levels of funding. So it's around 20-25% extra for schools in more deprived areas. And that partly comes through actual funding from in the formula, but also via the pupil premium. However, if we look at changes over the last 10-12 years, we know that schools in deprived areas have seen bigger cuts in spending per pupil than schools in less deprived areas. And that's partly because when the government introduced the national funding formula in April 2018, it provided the formula was more generous to schools in less deprived areas because of the introduction of minimum funding levels.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you to Bea, Luke and Lawrence. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you to the ESRC for putting on the Festival of Social Science. This is the first of 6 events the IFS will be hosting. There's another one on Thursday, looking at how we might create a more equal education system. That'll be at the same time, 1 p.m. on Thursday. And please do check, I'm sure if you Google ESRC, Festival of Social Science, you'll find lots of other interesting events. Thanks for joining and have a fantastic rest of the afternoon. Thanks for joining and have a fantastic rest of the afternoon.